Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we'll be talking about elasticity. So, one last term we need to understand is elasticity. And the reason you need to understand this is because it's going to become very, very important in Unit 2. This might seem a little like padding right now, but you're going to hear me talk about elasticity for that entire unit. It doesn't let up. So you need to understand this now. Now, what is elasticity? Well, an elasticity is the percentage change in one thing divided by the percentage change in another thing. And this number is going to depend on what range of the curve you're looking at. So in this course, we're really only concerned with one type of elasticity, and that is arc own price elasticity, or price elasticity. And we're going to look at that for supply and for demand. Supply elasticity, demand elasticity. What percentage does the quantity supplied or demanded change by for a certain percentage change in the price? Usually assumed to be a 1% change. Now, for this class, I don't care about the formula. I'm not going to make you memorize the formula. I'm not going to make you use the formula. I am going to do a little bit of math with the formula just to explain where a certain definition comes from in a little while. What I care about is the slope of the curve. Because if it's a flatter curve, it's going to be more elastic. It's going to have a higher elasticity. And if it's a steeper curve, it's going to be less elastic, and it's going to have a lower elasticity score. And you can see this here on our graphs. Dang thing. I was trying to annotate. Here we go. So for example, with these supply curves, the red one, it's very steep, and that would be considered a very inelastic curve. The pink one is very flat, and we would consider that a very elastic curve. And likewise with demand, well, supply and demand move in opposite directions. Supply goes up, demand goes down. But even though it's going down, it's still going down steeper, right? And so that's inelastic, whereas the pink one, it's flatter and it's elastic. Additionally, we have two extreme cases that we ought to talk about. So-called perfect elasticity, where elasticity is equal to infinity, and perfect inelasticity, where elasticity is equal to 0. Now, I told you that your elasticity corresponds directly to the steepness or the slope of the curve. So what do you reckon these are going to look like? Well, if elasticity is equal to infinity, an infinitely steep slope, that's going to be like a line that's straight up and down. Whereas if your elasticity is 0, if your slope is 0, if it's not steep at all, that's going to be like a flat line. Now, the real world interpretation would be like this. If something is perfectly elastic, that means that you are willing to take any quantity at one price. The quantity cannot change in response to the price. I changed the price by a certain percentage. The quantities, it doesn't change. This would be, from the consumer's perspective, the product for which you need a certain amount, you need it. You cannot do without that specific amount, but you don't need any more of it. Just that exact amount. And for the producer, that would be like a product which you cannot sell at any other price. Neither of these are very realistic. With consumers, you're never going to see this. If for no other reason than that, I don't believe there's any product which is completely useless beyond a certain amount. And we all have a budget, we all have an income, and you can't spend more than your income. When I say that, I understand every time I say that, I'm including debt, right? Debt is still it's drawn from your income. You do repay it eventually. For the producer, this can be a little more plausible. You're still going to run into resource constraints. I can't serve an order that big. There's not enough metal and oil and electricity in the world to make an order that big. But for a lot of simple scenarios, looking over a certain range of quantities, it can be perfectly elastic in real life for the producer. Perfect inelasticity, where it's straight up and down, well, that would imply that you're willing to pay any price for one quantity. You can change the price as much as you want, and the quantity isn't going to change. Now, this doesn't exist for demand for that same reason. You'd eventually run out of money if we made the price too big. But it can exist for supply if you have a unique product. As long as the price is higher than the minimum necessary to be willing to sell it, there's no way to make more of it. And so the price would not affect the decision to sell. What kind of goods would this apply to? Well, there's lots of different kinds. Unique pieces of artwork. Oh, the supply for paintings definitely slopes upwards. But the supply for an individual original copy of a painting, like Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, that is fixed. Likewise, ancient artifacts. You can make more of a reproduction, but you can't make more of the original. Original runs of discontinued automobile, Lecter's comic books. These are the kinds of products that we would consider to be perfectly inelastic. There is a fixed amount of them in this world, and it ain't going to change. Here you have a few graphs that show what this looks like. With perfect, so let's look at the supply side of it first. You have your perfectly inelastic supply, straight line up and down. You can move the price all you want, but you can't make any more or less of it. There's just a certain amount of that thing in the world. There's a certain amount of that painting, or a certain number of paintings that a famous painter made, a certain number of Rembrandts that were made. Can't be helped. Perfectly elastic supply. Well, you see that there's only one price that's considered acceptable. But the quantity, it can change. It can change by as much as it needs to. You won't get truly perfectly elastic supply, but you can get close to that. We'll talk about that in the competition lecture, though. And likewise with demand. Here's a scenario where you need a certain amount of something. Classic, stranded in the desert, you need water. You'd be willing to pay anything to get that water. And here's a case where demand is perfectly elastic. I don't care how much I get, but I'm only willing to pay one price for it. There's no way to come up with a realistic, perfectly elastic demand scenario. Now, what determines demand elasticity? Well, for demand, elasticity is driven mostly by substitutability. So if you have many or you have good substitutes, you're going to switch more in response to a price change. And the more narrowly we define the good, the more elastic its curve is going to be. So demand for food as a category is going to be pretty inelastic, won't it? Now, it's not perfectly inelastic, is it? Because people always have the option of eating less up to a certain point. Most Americans are not on the verge of starvation. They could choose to buy cheaper food, or they could choose to buy less food. But overall, I'd say that we tend to eat the amount of food that we feel comfortable with. And so you would expect demand for food to be pretty inelastic. That's what makes inflation so unpleasant, isn't it? Inflation doesn't just target luxuries. It doesn't just target fun things. It targets things that we need. And so we suck it up and we pay the price anyways. But if we were to talk about something a little more narrow, like restaurants, oh, well, you have to have food, but you don't have to have food from a restaurant, do you? If restaurant prices start to go up dramatically relative to groceries, relative to TV dinners, you won't eat at restaurants as much. And then say we make it a little more narrow and we start talking about fast food restaurants. Well, I'm sure you all have heard the news about how McDonald's is starting to offer financing options because the inflation's gotten so out of control. They're offering financing options on food. I just realized this is going to date my my video lectures in the future. Well, it can be a little hard to adjust from eating at restaurants to not eating at restaurants, right? A lot of people have busy schedules. Some people may not really have all the cookware that they need at home to cook properly. But to switch away from fast food restaurants to other types of restaurants, that's a lot more plausible. The whole reason people eat fast food is because it's cheaper and faster. So when it's no longer cheaper than sit down places, when it's no longer cheaper than roadside diners, people are going to switch to those. You can go more and more narrow with it. So, like in that example, I have fried chicken places and then Zaxby's, and then the Zaxby's on Tiger Boulevard specifically. The more narrowly the good is defined, the less unique it is, and so the less important it is to you that you get that specific good. And because of that, the good is going to be more elastic. Another major factor in determining demand elasticity, which I already hinted at, is how much of a necessity it is. If you genuinely need the good, if you need it to live, you're not going to be able to switch away as much. So, for example, if drinks at Tigertown Tavern doubled, I would expect that you would drink at Tigertown Tavern a lot less than you currently do. On the other hand, if gasoline prices doubled, what would you do? Well, you'd cut back on driving, right? That's that law of demand at work. You're not going to drive as much if it costs more. But you still have to get to work. You still have to get to class. You still have to go see your parents. Maybe you don't even see your parents as much if it costs a lot more to drive across the country. But I guarantee you're still going to go on Thanksgiving and Christmas, no matter how much it costs you. The more of a necessity is, the more inelastic it's going to be. Likewise, the more of a luxury it is, the more elastic it'll be. And if it's easier to adjust your plans in general, you'll switch more. Because oftentimes our purchases depend on other purchases. We have a certain rhythm to our lives, don't we? We buy things not in isolation, but we buy things to go with other things. Or we have long-term purchases we can make. If it's easier to mix things up, if it's easier to find an alternative, then the demand is going to be more elastic. Now, based on elasticity, we can classify goods into two different types. When a good has an elasticity of less than 1, we're going to call it inelastic. And when we're talking about demand, we're going to call that good a necessity. And when a good has an elasticity of more than 1, it's elastic. And if we're talking about demand, we're going to call that good a luxury. And if the good has an elasticity of 1, it's going to be called unit elastic. And that's just the point between necessity and luxury. And these aren't necessarily going to match up with what we laymen call necessities and luxuries. Now, much like our terms substitute and complement, normal and inferior, necessity and luxury do carry with them a judgment. We have an assumption that the thing is inelastic or elastic because of how important it is. Just understand that it's not necessarily, right? We use these words that seem to assume what the good is being used for, but it doesn't have to be. Now, the main reason why we're interested in this, the main reason why we would actually want to calculate a number, why we would have special definitions, is because we're interested in how they affect changes in total spending. Okay, don't freak out. I know you're gonna want to freak out, but don't freak out just yet, because I'm not gonna make you do this on a test either. But this will demonstrate how we get our definitions, or why we have this cutoff that we do. It'll be a little easier to work off my document camera for this. So, say that this is your old expenditure level. So E is your expenditures or spending, right? These are the same thing, synonyms. Q is your quantity, and P is your price. And we want to know what happens after the price changes. So this little apostrophe E prime, that means new expenditures. And if we're increasing the price, then by the law of demand, your quantity is going to go down, right? So 1 minus the change in quantity expressed as a percentage. And of course, we have 1 plus the change in price expressed as a percentage. Now, using our typical, properties of arithmetic, we can rearrange this. So we'll pull the P over to be next to the Q. And then we'll just multiply these two expressions by each other. Just making sure I have every step. And then note that that QP, that was equal to the old expenditure level. So the new expenditure level is going to be the old expenditure level times this big thing. Now let's say that we want to know when spending is going to go up because the prices went up. Well, in that case, this big thing here would have to be bigger than 1, right? We'd have to be multiplying by something larger than 1 instead of by a fraction. And so we can set it up. Cancel the ones. Move a few things around. Oh, sorry. Move a few things around. Now we're going to take a little cheat. We're going to have a little shortcut here. This number, because it is a percentage multiplied by a percentage, and because we're usually talking about very small changes anyways, it's going to be a very, very small fraction. And so we can say that it is approximately 0. It's not exactly 0, but it's very close to 0 most of the time. And so we can eliminate that. And then finally, last step, we get this expression right here. The percentage change in the quantity divided by the percentage change in the price would have to be less than 1 in order for the new expenditures to be higher than the old expenditures. That is to say, in order for the spending level to go up, the good has to be a necessity. And if you were to flip that inequality around, that would mean that it would have to be greater than 1. It would have to be a luxury for the spending level to actually go down instead. This is why we have that expression, why we have that calculation, and why we call it a necessity and a luxury, respectively. If increasing the price of a good means you wind up spending more on the good, that's a necessity. If increasing the price means you wind up spending less on the good, that's a luxury. Now, this bears thinking about just a little more, right? Because with both necessities and luxuries, you cut back on how much you buy. The law of demand holds for both of them. In both cases, if I make something more expensive, you're going to buy less of it. But the thing is, the price has still gone up. So if we're talking about the total amount of money you're spending, it's possible that you could be buying less, yet still be spending more. And that's probably the case for a lot of you with things like rent, gasoline, food, necessities. That's why we call them necessities. Your luxuries, on the other hand, those are the goods which they increase the price, you get pissed, and you stop spending as much because you're pissed and you're not willing to pay that much. A very good example of that would be movie theater tickets, right? It's a cliche at this point. Nobody goes to the movie theaters anymore. Their revenues are dropping dramatically because people are not willing to put up with the price hike, and they end up going to the movies so much less that the movie theaters are actually losing. Now, usually what we find is that raising the price of a good causes its elasticity to rise, and so goods go from being necessities to being luxuries. And this might sound kind of weird at first. How can something become a luxury? Either I need it or I don't. But the thing is, it's all relative. Like, for most of human history, people did not eat meat at every meal. For most of history, your dinner as an average person would be some fish. I know that's meat, right? But like not land animal meat. Fish, a bunch of bread. If you were in the South, it would have been cornbread and veggies and greens and things like that. Meat was something you hoped to maybe get like once a week. Maybe once a week you get to kill a chicken. Maybe once a year you get to eat beef. Well, in that kind of world, you would say that meat was a luxury. But we sure don't think of it that way now. Because adjusted for inflation, we have a lot more income and the prices of food is lower. Adjusted for inflation. We've got a lecture on inflation later in the semester. That explains how that's done. Meat has become a necessity to us because it's affordable enough for us to think of it as a necessity. Now, if prices were to, skyrocket, if, say, some terrible outbreak of mad cow disease or swine flu was to, kill off a number of animals, reduce the supply, and the prices shot up. If it cost you $20 a pound to get ground chuck, suddenly you wouldn't consider ground chuck a necessity anymore. Meat would not be a necessity in your household budget. This can go for other things too. People used to consider shoes to be somewhat of a luxury. You didn't expect to wear shoes all the time, at least not as a child. People would wear work boots in places where you needed protection on your feet, but you didn't wear them around the house. You didn't wear them, you know, out in the woods. What we consider necessities and luxuries, it's all relative. And as things become unaffordable, they become luxuries because of that. And the price at which the good is unit elastic is going to maximize revenues, not necessarily profits, because profits depend on both revenues and costs, but it's going to maximize revenues. We'll come back to that in another video. I want to have a natural stopping point so that these videos aren't too long.